Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, August 24th. I'm Laura Cornfield, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. A Palestinian stabbed a soldier with a knife at a roadblock near Yitzhar in Samaria a short while ago, injuring him lightly. The soldier was able to open fire with his weapon and killed the attacker. The incident occurred after Palestinians began stoning soldiers at the roadblock from inside a vehicle. The soldiers gave chase, and one of the Palestinians turned on him with a knife. The soldier suffered light wounds in his neck and was evacuated to Beilinson Hospital for treatment. At least 38 people were killed and dozens are still unaccounted for in central Italy, where a 6.2 magnitude earthquake struck mountainous towns and villages before dawn this morning. According to reports, much of the town of Amitre was reduced to rubble, with the epicenter said to be near the town of Akumole. No Israeli tourists were injured in the earthquake, the foreign ministry said, adding Israel had offered to send assistance to the region. The quake struck the regions of Umbria, Lazio, and Marche in the early hours of the morning when most people were still asleep, shaking buildings and trapping residents under piles of rubble. At daybreak, rescue workers with earth-moving equipment and dogs began searching for survivors. Some 100 people were still unaccounted for in the village of Peschiera del Tronto, which had been leveled to the ground. Emergency officials said the areas hit were full of summer vacationers and expressed fears the death toll could rise. We woke up to news of a strong earthquake in central Italy this morning, which caused extensive damage and loss of life. Joining us today in the studio to discuss chances of a major earthquake occurring here is Dr. Gidi Ber of the Geological Survey of Israel. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. Israel is located on the Syrian-Africa rift. Are we due for a big one soon? And can we expect a major earthquake here in Israel, taking into account that the last major earthquakes in the country destroyed Jerusalem and Sfat?
Yeah, we're due to a major earthquake. We don't know when it will come. We know more or less where it will strike. It will strike somewhere along the Dead Sea Rift, which you call the Syrian-African rift. So it will strike somewhere along this rift, and we have to be prepared for it, of course.
Dr. Ber, there was a 5.5 magnitude earthquake in southern Israel in May of this year. Is this a sign that a stronger one is on its way here?
No, it's not necessarily a sign of a stronger one coming soon after it. Usually earthquakes of that size occur once in a few years, and we had several of those magnitude in recent decades. So signs for a major one are much more complicated to identify.
How damaging would an earthquake similar to the size and strength of the one in Italy be in Israel?
Well, the recent earthquake in 1927 was of that magnitude. It was 6.2. It was along the Dead Sea, and it had about 300 fatalities in Jerusalem, in Amman, in Ramle and Lod, and in other places. But that was about almost 100 years ago, when the buildings were built differently and when there were much less population. So no one could really guess. Well, we have some kind of maps that are about to calculate the numbers of injured fatalities. I cannot say exactly at this moment what would be the toll of a 6.2 earthquake, but we can, upon request, we can do the calculation and say more or less what would be the toll of such an earthquake.
Are there any specific areas in Israel that are more prone to earthquakes than the other areas?
Yeah, well, the Syrian-African rift, the Dead Sea Rift, is prone to the earthquake itself. So most of the sources of the earthquakes are along that zone, from Metula in the north to Eilat and further south and further north also. Those are the areas where the earthquakes will occur, where the fault will move and create the waves. But there are areas which are more prone to damage due to the specific site conditions of those areas. For example, in many of the recent earthquakes, the recent large ones in the last century, for example, or the last 1,000 years, places like Ramle Lod were suffered much more damage than areas which were cities which were on rock, because the soft material which these places are built on amplifies the seismic waves. So there are areas, and we have maps which actually show which areas are more prone to amplification than other areas.
How prepared is Israel to deal with the after effects of a major earthquake?
The after effect, or
with the earthquake and the after
with
effects?
the earthquake and the after. Well, Israel is trying to be prepared as best as possible. Of course, we have a lot more to do. We are having maps which would help us plan correctly, not on areas which are magnified, but on areas which are less magnified. We have maps which will help us plan not on landslides, but in other areas. And the most recent development is that we are now building a short time early warning system, which will not warn before the earthquake occurs, but it will warn the population immediately after the earthquake occurs and before the destructive waves will arrive the population. So this system is working in a way that it will catch the waves very close to the source, and it will deliver the notice very quickly, so that places which are far enough away from the source will get the notice before the waves come, and will have a few seconds, maybe up to 20 seconds, to evacuate the buildings or to do any other measures that are needed.
Is this system in place already?
This is, at the moment, it is prepared. We have a bid for the construction of the instruments, and I assume that in the next 1 year or a year and a half, it will be ready. Then we'll have about a year more to check it, to see that we don't have false alarms, that we don't miss some alarms. And the problem is that, the good problem is that we don't have so many earthquakes to test it. So the testing time will also be a little longer than it may have been in other countries like California or Japan, where there are a lot of earthquakes that you can test by them. So this is the good and the bad news with our system. But in a couple of years, we are hoping to have this system working, and maybe this would reduce a little bit of the casualties. It would not reduce the damage, because the wave will arrive, but it will help people to evacuate the buildings and so on. So it would reduce fatalities. That's what we hope.
Dr. Gidi Bear, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you.
In other news, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is planning a joint summit with the leaders of the 15 members of the Economic Community of West Africa states. Officials warn the summit could be derailed because of Nigeria's reluctance to give its approval. In order for the committee to extend an invitation to Netanyahu, it requires all member states to unanimously approve the move. A Jerusalem Post report says it is proving to be increasingly problematic in securing Nigeria's consent. In July, ECOWAS signed a joint declaration with Netanyahu welcoming his participation in a future summit, similar to the one he held with East African heads of state during his recent multi-state visit. Meanwhile, the president of Togo is planning a separate Israeli-African Security and Development Summit next spring to be attended by leaders across the continent. At least 200 tons of crude oil have spilt into the Red Sea, reportedly after a pipe burst at the Jordanian port city of Aqaba. According to a joint statement by Israel's Foreign and Environment Ministries, Jerusalem has offered assistance in the cleanup efforts following a joint oil spill drill with the Jordanians last November, but Jordan is opting for now to handle the spill itself. The Environment Ministry is monitoring the possible impact on Eilat's beaches, which will absorb some of the leak, while initial reports indicate the bulk of the oil is drifting southwards towards Saudi Arabia. The 200-ton spill represents a drop in the ocean compared to the 2014 ecological disaster when 5 million liters of crude oil erupted in the Avrona Nature Reserve from the Trans-Israel pipeline. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Russian President Vladimir Putin discussed the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and regional issues in a telephone conversation Tuesday night. The Kremlin presidential website said the two exchanged opinions on issues surrounding the settlement in the Middle East and current aspects of the general situation in the region. There was no comment from the Prime Minister's office concerning the conversation. Last night's exchange occurred just days after Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi announced that Putin was willing to host Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Moscow for direct talks aimed at jump-starting the peace process. Israel and Turkey are expected to exchange ambassadors in the coming days, signaling the renewal of diplomatic ties between the two countries after a 6-year rift. Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu made the announcement during a press conference yesterday. The names of the ambassadors have yet to be announced. The development comes barely 24 hours after Jerusalem and Ankara exchanged fierce recriminations over Israel's pounding of Hamas targets in Gaza following the firing of a rocket at the southern Israeli town of Sderot. Turkey's condemnation came just days after its parliament ratified an agreement with Israel aimed at strengthening ties between the two countries. Israel will not tolerate any disturbances of the quiet and will respond swiftly and firmly. That was the message delivered by President Reuven Rivlin yesterday during a tour of the country's southern border, 2 days after a rocket was fired at Sderot from the Gaza Strip. Accompanied by the Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot, and senior IDF commanders, Rivlin also visited one of the cross-border tunnels built by Hamas, recently uncovered by the Army. After receiving a briefing from the Army echelon, Rivlin met with soldiers serving at the Gaza border, as well as residents living in communities close to the border fence. The coordinator of government activities in the territories announced the completion of Operation Safari this morning, transferring the last animals from Gaza's Khan Yunis Zoo to other zoos in Israel and abroad. According to the statement, the exodus through the area's crossing included 1 tiger, 2 monkeys, 2 ostriches, 2 deer, 2 eagles, 2 turtles, a swan, and a porcupine. The operation was initiated by the International Four Paws Animal Charity and conducted with the cooperation of the Palestinian Ministry of Agriculture and the Defense Ministry's Crossings Authority. The coordinator of the government activities added that the Khan Yunis Zoo is closing due to operational difficulties and a failure to offer adequate care for its animals. The zoo was popularly dubbed the worst in the world after it began exhibiting the mummified corpses of animals that had starved to death. But in the Ramat Gan Safari, there was good news. Tanda, a 23-year-old mother of 3, has given birth to her 4th baby rhinoceros. The baby male rhino came in at a bouncing 50 kilos. Tanda is a rare white rhino who has been at the safari for 13 years. Zoo workers knew she was about to give birth after a long gestation period when she started to produce milk and drove away her 2-year-old daughter. The mother and baby are currently kept in isolation away from the crowds, but are expected to be joining the other 25 rhinos of the herd next week. The white rhinos are critically endangered species. A British tourist was killed by a knife-wielding French tourist yelling Allah Akbar, God is great, at Backpackers Hostel in Home Hill, a quiet coastal town in Queensland, North Australia. Another British tourist was seriously injured in last night's attack, and a dog at the premises was killed by the perpetrator. The British tourist was named Maya Elif Chung, a 21-year-old university student who was touring Australia. The 29-year-old Frenchman was taken into custody by police, but he still has not been charged. Police have yet to describe the attack a terror incident, saying they are still investigating the motives.
Initial inquiries indicate that comments may have been, which may be construed to have of being as of an extremist nature, were made by the alleged offender. It is alleged that the suspect used the phrase Allah Akbar during the attack and when arrested by police. We've had 3 people stabbed, one dead, deceased, and 1 critically injured. It's a shocking attack by any standard. So the motivations for it are unclear. As I said, there are many or a number of different circumstances that could be at play here, and our investigation is trying to determine what they are.
In France, photographs have emerged of armed French police forcing a woman on the beach in Nice to remove her clothing, enforcing the controversial ban on the burkini swimwear favored by Muslim women. The woman was given a fine for not wearing an outfit respecting good morals and secularism and heckled by beachgoers. In Israel, there are no bans, and Muslim women are seen wearing burkinis when visiting the country's beaches. In France, it's a different story, where several French towns, including Nice, banned clothing that overtly manifests adherence to a religion at a time when France and places of worship are the target of terrorist attacks. The measure is being challenged in France's highest administrative court tomorrow after a Nice court ruled the ban necessary, appropriate, and proportionate in light of the likelihood of the swimwear offending the religious convictions or non-convictions of beachgoers. The Australian designer of the burkini, which exposes only the face, hands, and feet, said sales have jumped 200% since the ban. Staying with the ocean and beaches, an iron treasure trove of artifacts retrieved from the sea near Hadera have been turned over to the Israel Antiquities Authority. Some of the items are over 3,500 years old. The trove includes a beautifully decorated ancient hand grenade from the Crusader period. Other items include a toggle pin and the head of a knife from the Middle Bronze Age, around 3,500 years ago, and other artifacts are 2 mortars and 2 pestles, fragments of candlesticks, and more from around the 11th century CE. According to the Antiquities Authority, the items were found by the late Marcel Matzliach, who worked for decades at the electric plant in Hadera and apparently found them on the beach there. He bequeathed them to his family, who recognized their historical importance and turned them over to the authority. Archaeologists believe the items were manufactured in Syria and were probably part of a shipwreck. The family is to receive a certificate of appreciation for their move. In local money matters, shares were mixed on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, while the shekel was mixed in foreign currency trading. Here are the numbers. And turning to the weather, the IBA weather team says there will be no significant change in the forecast over the next 24 hours. Here are the highs and lows at home and abroad. And that's all for this newscast. Please join us again tomorrow, same time, same channel, when Elon Aslan Levy will be back at this desk. I'm Laura Cornfield, wishing you a good evening and shalom from Jerusalem.